Thank you very much, Manu. Thank you, Manu and Cara, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you in this webinar series. Welcome to everybody who is watching here from southern Brazil. I don't know if many people in the audience know Brazil or southern Brazil, so I'm happy to share some of our experiences and also some of our landscape with you. And so just to briefly introduce myself before I start the presentation. I'm a vegetation ecologist and restoration ecologist, originally from Central Europe, from Germany. But in the past 12 years or so, I've been working in southern Brazil and mostly with grassland ecosystems. And in the past, I would say 5 years, my main focus has actually been on restoration research, mostly, with lots of links also to practice and application, because in my perspective, research has to be applied and connected to practice, and we really need this here to advance. So I will give you a rather broad talk, mostly focusing on research, but I hope to show you also some links to practice, to application. And of course, I'm excited to discuss things then with all of you, also with experiences you have from other regions in the world. And of course, I'm sure I will also learn from all of you and the questions and the discussions, because we are still very much at the beginning of grassland restoration here in Brazil. So to start, I will show you a map of Brazil. And before I bring the map, all of you maybe just think of what you know of Brazil and what vegetation is like in Brazil. And maybe this map will surprise you, because I'm showing you a different perspective of Brazil. Brazil is known to be a forest country. We have the Amazon forest, we have the Atlantic forest. These are, of course, extremely important ecosystems with global relevance in terms of carbon and biodiversity. But about 1/4 of Brazil, about a little bit more, 27%, actually is covered by grasslands and savannas. So this is a map that shows that, of course, in the central part, the Cerrado savannas, tropical savannas, but then you also see in all other regions of the country, grassland systems dominating in the Pantanal and also in the south, which is the region I work on. So I won't be talking about the Cerrado savannas, the real tropical savannas, which are, of course, extremely interesting ecosystems, and actually where there's interesting restoration experiences going on as well that might be of interest for many people here in the group as well. But so, of course, Brazil's forests are important, need to be conserved and also restored. But let's take a look at the grasslands, and in my case, specifically the grasslands here in the south, which you see pointed out in this map of grasslands of South America. I work in this circuit region, which is a transition region between the tropical Brazil and the temperate portion of South America, which we have then in Argentina and in Chile. And you see on the right map that the grasslands I work in, which is the region in black, what we call the Campos Sulinos, the South Brazilian grasslands, they actually continue in Uruguay and in Argentina, and maybe are even better known than the South Brazilian grasslands outside of Brazil. So the famous Pampa grasslands. So that's the region I work in, and I will give you a few impressions of the landscapes. You can see here in southern Brazil, we have some landscapes that are really dominated by grasslands, rather flat plains, beautiful landscapes with high biodiversity in the grasslands, where we hardly see trees. We do have some trees interspersed in the grasslands, so by climate, tree growth is possible here. This is a subtropical humid climate, so we have a lot of rainfall actually. But as there's grazing activities going on, as there have been naturally fires in the system, we have a domination of grasslands in the region. You see some trees. Trees have a high importance, of course, as well. Farmers plant trees because they need wood, but they also are important for the grazing animals to give some comfort in the hot summer days. So temperatures here go up to the upper 30s in centigrade. We have some very beautiful landscape with interesting geological formation like these remnant rocks here, where you then can also see vegetation mosaics with some woody vegetation, usually at the more humid slopes or in protected river valleys. They can be more dominant in some regions depending on the landscape. And we even have some regions really with forest grassland mosaics, often associated also to specific geological situations like these granite outcrops here in southeastern Rio Grande do Sul state. We have a very small part in our region where we have a savanna-like vegetation. I don't call it savanna because we're not in a tropical climate. It's more like a transition to the Chaco region, which sets on in Argentina, goes to the feet of the Andes, so where we have these dry woody elements coming in, like here Prosopis affinis. And then if you go up to the Atlantic forest biome, where we have large grassland regions as well, we also find mosaics of grasslands and forests that are kept like this by disturbance regimes, fire, and also grazing animals. Grasslands in mosaic with Araucaria forests. So these forests are a bit relictual from cooler climatic periods in the past. Here you can see really mosaics, but we also have regions with extended grasslands. And what's nice to see in this picture, maybe in the back, you see this stone wall. So this indicates that these landscapes actually are also cultural landscapes that have been used for cattle grazing since early colonization. So when the Portuguese and the Spanish came to this region in the 17th century for colonization, of course, they brought cattle, and soon cattle, mostly cows, spread all about the region, and this region is being managed by cattle grazing until today. Here's another picture which shows quite nicely mosaics even of the grassland themselves, basically due to management. You see some cattle in the back, and you see some greener patches where the farmer manages a bit more intensively, and then the more shrubby patches where there's just grazing going on. And then sometime maybe somebody needs a place to travel to. We have some beautiful landscape with impressive canyons. So I think it's a region that's not so well known around the world, but that's very interesting to get to know too. So these are a lot of nice landscapes, and of course associated to this diversity of landscapes, of grassland landscapes, we have a very high biodiversity. You can imagine that in each of these 9 pictures here, we have different dominant plant species. I won't go into any detail here. I'm a botanist myself, but I don't think there's time to talk too much about species. So I just have one slide just to illustrate the high biodiversity of our grasslands. Illustrate this by this map of the priority areas for conservation, which was established for the Pampa biome. So that's the southern part of the region I work with, where you see that about 60–70% of the region actually is classified as priority area for conservation because of biodiversity. And of course, plant biodiversity is a very important part here. Just a few pictures here to illustrate that. We have in this region, in the Pampa biome, a total of about 3,500 plant species, and 2/3 of these are grassland species. So actually, if we want to conserve biodiversity in this region of Brazil, we need to conserve and also restore the grasslands. And this not only for plant species diversity, but of course also for other species groups. So we have a lot of insects, birds, other animals that of course are dependent on grassland ecosystems. So this is the nice side of the nice landscapes, the nice biodiversity, but of course we have other situations, but we will talk about degradation in a few minutes. But before I start with that, I want to point out a few ecological characteristics of our region. So the first is that this dominance of natural grasslands with the mixture of C3 and C4 species, so a mixture of temperate and tropical grass species, and with lots of legumes also, so a high diversity of interesting forage species, enables our region to have cattle grazing based on natural grasslands and not on planted pasture. There's these two small maps here that show on the left hand the concentration of planted pastures in Brazil. So you see that central Brazil is dominated by planted pastures, mostly by Urucloa and other tropical species. But on the right side, you see when you go down to southern Brazil, the dark patches that in our region, native pastures, so natural grasslands, are the basis for livestock grazing. The picture below is from an experimental site where we have an exclosure on the right and the grazed side on the left. And you see that grazing, of course, changes vegetation structure quite drastically, but the species composition remains native. So this is really a privilege here that we have the potential to really bring conservation and sustainable use together. I will come back to this topic at the end of my presentation. So that's important. We really have this potential to bring conservation and economic use and thus sustain of households, of families, of small or large grazing companies or family grazing together. Then when we go more to the ecological sides, where does this come from? We can take a look at the biological features of the plant species that are here. These pictures are actually not plants from our region, but I took them out of a paper where we discuss what we call old growth grasslands. So these are natural grasslands. They are adapted, or the plants that compose these grasslands are adapted to disturbance regimes like fire and grazing. So you see here examples of underground structures of species, as you know from many other grasslands in the tropics and subtropics around the world, and that allow these species to sprout again after fire, after grazing. And this smaller graph with the lines shows the presence in black of carbon particles in a peat profile, where we can see we always had fire in the system. Of course, fire frequency was never constant. It, of course, was influenced by human populations, but we always had it in the system as a natural disturbance regime, and we also had dominance of grasses. And only quite recently, actually, in the peat profiles we see an increase in woody species. So about roughly the past 3,000 to 5,000 years, when climate started to become a bit warmer and a bit more humid, we start to have an expansion of forests over grasslands. But so we have these ancient grasslands with a high level of endemic species also, and mostly composed of species that are well adapted to fire and grazing. And of course, the way we manage will influence a little bit the vegetation structure and the composition, but it remains a natural grasslands. On the other side, we have a very low resilience to stronger human disturbances like conversion. So if we convert a grassland to another system and use it as a soybean field or for a pine plantation or whatever you can think of for a while, and then want to bring it back to be a grassland, it's very difficult. So this is a study where we sampled a total of 80 sites with different land use history, and I simplified a little bit here. In white are the primary grasslands, so the natural systems, and in gray and black are the systems that have a history of it's the opposite. In green, the green line divides the primary systems, PG, primary grasslands, from the secondary grasslands, which go up from the red line on. So what's important is that we have a clear separation of both types of systems, okay? So after abandonment of any land use, the natural grassland does not easily recover, because many species are dispersal limited. So they are very adapted to natural disturbances, but they won't come back easily. But then, of course, today land use changes the reality in most of the region. I've showed you the nice pictures. Now I showed you the examples of land use change and of degradation. Below is a very typical landscape in many parts of the state, where the natural grasslands have just been transformed into soybean or sometimes wheat or whatever plantations, and what is left as natural vegetation are actually riparian forests that are more protected than grasslands. So they were not always converted, but grasslands were. Then we have, of course, regions used for pine plantation, and the picture here is actually not a plantation, it is pine coming back after the trees in a plantation had been felled. So if it's not replanted, it will still again become a pine monoculture. And you see now, just for our state, I didn't have data for the entire region, that in many regions we have already lost very large parts of the grasslands, especially in the northern part here where we have the more fertile soils. Large parts of the grasslands have been completely lost. And this data actually is from 2002, so land use change has been going on at very fast rates here. So we have a lot of situations of degradation. This is a site in the coastal region, the coastal plains where there had been a pine plantation. This is actually within a national park, so this really needs to be urgently restored. Then we have situations in the highland grasslands, again a site that had been used for pine plantation, and then they were cut, and this is just the way it was left. And you see, of course, vegetation coming up, but it's not close to natural vegetation. This is what this site would look like about 20 years later. So it's a similar site that had been cut and where no restoration was done about 20 years ago. So it's definitely not a natural grassland. We have some shrubby vegetation with lots of pine trees coming up. Here we have another situation where a natural grassland in a mountain region is invaded by gorse, Ulex europaeus, which had been introduced many years ago as an ornamental plant and has spread immensely in some parts of the region. And I won't also go into much detail, but just to exemplify the large problem we have, the immense problem we have with invasive species in general. So our most problematic invasive species is Eragrostis plana, which comes from South Africa, which has spread over most of the region and often occupies immense areas with very high cover. But then we have often mixtures with other species, even though it may look like a grassland. If you take a closer look, you find many exotic species. We have pine, we have gorse. So invasive species is a large issue, of course, also for restoration. So after this presentation, when we come to restoration, of course, you all know this figure or other figures of that kind. We will look at each site, we will look at the resilience, we look at what's going on in terms of degradation, we look at the landscape context, and we will think of our restoration strategy, right, from active to passive. And that's what we do here. I have this conceptual model. We have the original ecosystem, and it may have changed considering the soil conditions, the substrate, so the abiatic part, or in terms of species composition. And if these changes were not so severe, we often try to do the restoration just by changing management. So by reintroducing management or changing management regimes using grazing and fire. I will show you some examples. But it's important that we consider that passive restoration, in the sense you make a fence and just let it develop, won't work for these grasslands, because then you will have biomass accumulation, you will have shrubs and trees coming in. So we need the management regime from as the natural systems have. So this is similar, of course, in many other grassland regions in the world that are under productive climatic conditions. So we understand that cattle, even though it's exotic, is an important part of the system, and it kind of substitutes the megafauna that had been present here but today is extinct. So you see clearly that in these pictures, which are all at the same sites but made in paddocks with different forage levels, so different amounts of biomass left because cattle stocking loads vary. You see this is all the same grassland, but it differs considerably in terms of structure and composition, from the overgrazed on the upper left to the very lowly grazed site on the lower right, which is almost an abandonment, where you already have losses of species diversity. So in cases of abandonment, which leads to species losses, and overgrazing, which leads to species losses, what we try to do is change grazing management, for instance, by conducting deferments, so taking cattle out for periods of a few months to let vegetation recover. I'm showing results of a study here where you can see that in the moderate grazing intensity treatment, where actually there was no degradation, it was a good treatment, basically what you see here on the upper right, where biodiversity actually is high. Taking cattle out for a period of 3 months doesn't make much of a difference. But in the severe grazing intensity treatment, it does. So we have deferment in 2 periods here. Sorry, it's not complete, the legend on the map, in comparison to the control where no cattle exclusion was made, which is the blue bar. And we see that spring deferral, that's the green bar, really leads to a significant increase in sward height, and also we have an increase in forage mass, so in biomass, and also I'm not showing this data in terms of plant species diversity. So situations like overgrazing for a period, that's totally, well, not totally, but relatively easy to recover by changing management. Here the same from another study where simply there was a change in management from extended grazing all over the area to a rotational grazing system, which means we control better the use of biomass by cattle. And you see we have along this period of 5 years, a clear increase in biomass, which is interesting because that's productivity. So for the farmer, that's a good result. And also in plant diversity here using an index, but we could also look at the richness values or at another index. We will get different, we get very similar results. So grazing management can increase productivity and increase biotic compositions in cases of rather low degradation. But the problem is, of course, when we have more severe changes. So when then really active restoration in the sense of changing or modifying substrate conditions or actively introducing species becomes relevant. So first of all, we can look at site conditions. I already showed you this picture. You don't need a lot of data to see that this will be very difficult to recover. It will be very difficult for grassland species to colonize, even if they're around, because the site conditions are changed. You have this layer of pine needles of about 10 centimeters here, which is very hot, which is very different than the natural soil conditions, which here would be a sandy soil. And of course, we need some management here. So we have done some experience. So I will show you results from recent projects where we removed this litter layer in experimental plots by burning and by manual removal. And of course, we're doing this in a small scale here. But it worked very well. And so again, disturbances are interesting and important for conservation, also restoration. Fire is a very polemic issue here because it had been forbidden for a long time, because of course it's a problem in many ecosystems. So in forests, it's a big problem. And unfortunately, this has led to a taboo to work with fire, even for grasslands, where one could think that it could be a natural system, that natural disturbance that could help in conservation. So here at this site, it was easier to convince people we need to remove this pine litter. And so we compared sites or plots where we burned with plots where we did the manual removal on the lower right, which of course is also possible. It's possible in a small plot of 5 to 5 meters, but do this in an area of 200 hectares, then it will be much too expensive and virtually impossible to remove pine litter by manual removal. So fire worked very well here as a first step for restoration, and it had the very nice effect that it basically took out the pine seedlings and the pine seeds out of the systems. So in the plots where we burned, we had extremely low pine recruitment in comparison to the plots where we had not burned, where we had not removed at all, or we had done the manual removal. So these, you can see this in these two graphs, one after 12 months, the other after 24 months. So pine individuals actually did not recruit or in very small quantities after the fire treatment. So it was much more efficient in restoration than the manual litter removal, which is an important result, of course, for practice for people managing this national park. We did similar experiments in other systems. Of course, if anybody wants more data or information on that, I will be very happy to share with you some experiences and some papers. So here, for instance, we are working with control of Urucloa, which is the grass in the back. Did several plots also where we did manual removal, where we worked with herbicides. And we did manage to control Urucloa, but the big problem is native species cover. So I point out here the results, the good result in green. We did manage to remove, control Urucloa, but we did not manage to get species richness or cover back up in relation to the control side. So seed banks in these systems often are depleted after longer periods of other use. Actually, our seed banks are rather small in terms of the dominant species. They don't have a very high importance in the seed banks. Seed banks are composed of the rural species of Superaceous, but especially the grasses and the legumes that are typical of the systems often are not found in the seed bank in large quantities. And as you can here see, after use of pine plantation, the seed bank is extremely poor. So basically, we do not expect after such a land use that much species will come back from a soil seed bank. Of course, this can be different after other types of degradation. So after agricultural use, we have lots of rural species coming up, but not the desired species, and often also invasive species. So we need seeds. We need introduced species. That's usually in grasslands done by seeds in restoration. And that's the big challenge we are now working on. And I think it really is a challenge, a limitation at the moment that impedes us to start really restoring in larger scales. And of course, I have to tell anybody here that how important this is. So the question is, what seeds do we use? Where are the seeds? So if you talk to somebody from agronomy, or if you go to a store or take a look in the internet, what you can get, we find seeds of these species easily available on the market. And this is actually what people will buy when they want to recover a grassland. So Lolium multiflorum, Holcus lanatus, Avena, Vicia craca, Trifolium happens, and others. So these are all forage species. These are exotic species. So they may help to re-establish a grassland that can be grazed, that has productivity, but they will not help us to restore native biodiversity, at least not when I look at the plant. There's more species than that. Of course, there's more tropical species as well. We have this mixture here, so it depends a bit on the time of the year you will start your sowing, what we will use. But anyway, I won't go into details on that. But the problem is we don't have native seeds that are being used for restoration. So we have a very agronomic perspective, which is important. We need to support the farmers, of course, but where is native diversity? So the first thing we did, of course, when we started to work about this is to really go out and check which seeds are available. And from this diversity of more than 2,000 plant species, we found a list of 8 species being sold as ornamental plants, actually. So basically, there are 2 grasses only that you could buy as seeds and maybe use in a restoration project. So that's a very, very small fraction, of course, of the native biodiversity we have. And so we really need to advance, and I will come to this at the very end, in terms of selecting seeds and growing plants to produce seeds and to start to build up a network to sell seeds. But so at the moment we can't buy seeds, still we have to restore. So what do we have to think? Where to get the seeds from if you can buy it? And of course, they're in the grasslands. Just some pictures here showing you seeds naturally in the system. So sometimes even being produced by the natural grasslands in large quantities, and you find them at the roadsides. Here we have lots of seeds of Aristida, which has these long awns, so they stick together and are dispersed by wind, and you find a large accumulation of weeds on the roadside. And then, of course, there's many other species, and they all produce seeds, of course. So we can buy seeds, so we think of alternative techniques, and of course, these techniques are well known in other parts of the world. So one of them we're working with is seed transport by cattle. using the grazing cattle as a restoration agent, not only to control biomass, as I had shown you before, influencing structure by feeding, but also by transporting seeds in the cattle dung. So this is a study where we evaluated the amount of species and the abundance of seed transported in cattle dung along the year. And you see that except for winter, when we have very few species flowering, we have a high abundance of seeds and a high richness of species in cattle dung. So we can actively use cattle, taking it from one area to another to bring seeds into the system. Of course, you have to be extremely careful about invasive species. So the cattle shouldn't be grazing at a site with presence of invasive species. So that's one process, a natural process we can use to increase diversity at restoration sites. And the other techniques we have been doing lots of research lately with some success is hay transfer, which is well known from other regions around the world. Here, a recently published paper where we had some pictures. So we have actually, it's the same site I showed you before where we did the fire experiment. So after the removal of pine litter, we used hay to get the native species back. Here you just have some impressions of the reference site where we collected the hay and natural grasslands, then the site before the restoration, and then 3 plots in a control in C, and then in D and in E where we have vegetation coming back, and E is an example of a site where we had put some hay. So it actually did work, and we did increase vegetation cover and species richness by hay. Most clearly is the result for vegetation cover after some times. You see here the different treatments. C is the control, then we have M, the manual removal of pine litter, and B, the burnt, and then with or without hay transfer. And the orange box is the box with hay transfer. So you see that hay transfer really did lead to an increase in vegetation cover. So we did increase, introduce seeds, but in terms of species richness, effects were not very prominent after 2 years. They were quite prominent in the first year, but after 2 years, the effect was not very visible anymore, at least not in all situations. But we already had seed dispersal going on then in the experimental plots, of course, because some species already started to reproduce. So we do consider this is a very good result that will facilitate restoration, because you can just use hay from with seeds from adjacent natural communities. But then, of course, there may be more to study here, and we started doing that because we know that it will very much depend on the timing of harvest and on the quantity of hay. We know that from other regions in the world, and we now have some fresh results on that, so I won't be sharing too much here with you because of time also, and we're still working on the results. But you can just see in these small pictures here where we illustrate the relative composition of species. So forbs, we lump together in groups, but then you see the relative cover of grasses, and you can see easily that this species, which you see in the picture, Casculitrum uniole, was very much present in hay collected in November and in January, but not at all in February, and other species come in. So this reflects the situation that we have a subtropical system, and we have species flowering from, say, grasses flowering from, say, September until May. So, of course, when we want to restore and we want to get the full diversity of these species, we will have to think about transferring hay, collecting and transferring hay at more than one point of time. And then, of course, we show also here in this experiment on the left-hand side, you have the plots with 500 grams of hay per square meter, and on the right of 1 kilo. Then this also changes species composition, because you have effects of the hay layer itself, and this can be beneficial for some species and negative for others, depending on light requirements, etc. So this is what we're now doing research on. And I show this again here just for the forbs. So we separate the data into grasses and into forbs. I won't go into detail, but just to illustrate you how much amount of hay and timing of hay can change species composition. So hay transfer works, but we still have a lot to find out on how to conduct it in practice over larger areas, when to collect, maybe should store the hay for some time, etc. So this is a very interesting line of research. But of course, it would be even better to really just collect the seeds. And I won't show you any data, just something we really started research on right now before I come to the end here. So we started working with mechanized seed collection. So we constructed the machine, this equipment, which actually, following examples already working in Australia and also in Uruguay. It's a machine that we take a tractor, we run through the grassland with it, and it does not cut the vegetation. It has brushes the vegetation and then collects the seeds into a container. And so then after, this is our first experiment, after a morning of collecting seeds, we have the result here. Of course, this is very low purity of seeds. You get a lot of blooms and parched branches and patches of inflorescences in, but also a lot of seeds. We're now starting to put out in experimental plots to see if this is more efficient than hay transfer, because of course the concentration of seeds here is much higher. So coming to a close here, so we have time for some discussion. This was a short overview of some of the research we're doing. The next steps, of course, and I think the key steps to be able to upscale restoration of grasslands, and this is of course a big goal here in policy as well. So only in the Pampa region, Brazil's national aim is to restore 300,000 hectares until 2030. So that's a lot. And we are at about 5,000 at the moment and at very initial stages on restoration. So we need to define which species are the most important. We have done some work on that. We need to study the seed ecology of these species. We all know almost nothing about the native species. Farmers had been using exotic species, forage species for a long time, so we have experience with exotic species, but did not value the native biodiversity. We need to investigate the best sowing methods. I showed you some of that. Also, which mixtures of species would be most interesting to use, at what time we should use them, how to store them, how long to store them, and all of that. And then we need to develop seed production chains, or collection and then cultivation and production change. And I won't go into this here. I think there's no time, but I think this is a very important topic because it starts to get into restoration economics. So we need to think about how to pay for restoration and how to make restoration also attractive for farmers. So the idea is that farmers can also, they will produce cattle on the land, which is use that's compatible with conservation of biodiversity, but they could also dedicate part of their grasslands to the production of seeds for restoration in other areas, and we have to find mechanism to make this economically viable, to organize this process. And fundamental for this, at least here in Brazil, but also in other parts of the world, is to overcome some biases we still have in the restoration debate. In Brazil, the debate remains quite heavily focused on forests. Of course, I'm today just talking about grassland, but the big restoration projects for which Brazil is well known are all in forests, principally in the Atlantic forests. So we call this the tropical grassy restoration myth. So there's a paper out there led by Fernando Silveira, with colleagues from Brazil and other places of the world, where we discuss some of these myths that still need to be overcome, and we need to discuss and convince society that we also have to restore grasslands in the regions where grassland are natural, and not just focus on the forests that have many benefits, of course, but so do grasslands. And I think the most important thing then is to look at Brazil as a whole. Again, I bring this map now with the indication of regions that had been lost, where native vegetation was destroyed in beige here. So you see these are considerable parts in the Cerrado, in the tropical savannas, but also in southern Brazil. And of course, in these regions, we would have many areas to restore all these grassland vegetation types here. And with this, make the link to the local culture. So here, final picture of typical land management in the Brazilian Pampa, where you have the gaucho working with cattle and with this conserving grasslands. And so when we restore grasslands, we will also restore the culture, the local culture and the lifestyle of the people. So that's an important debate, of course, as well. And I think we'll give many initiatives and incentives to restoration. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to stay here for another 20 minutes or so to answer questions, to discuss with you, and I'm curious about your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. And one of the questions I was going to ask was about priority research needs. So I really appreciated that you summarized those at the end of your presentation. We do have quite a few questions in the Q&A box. For all of our participants, please do feel free to post your questions there and I'll answer them for you. And we'll start off with the earliest one that came in from Shanmuga, who is asking, eradicating invasive species is a challenge in itself. There may not be any one particular method. How do you proceed to eradicate invasive species, especially given that ecosystem restoration is a continuum?
Yeah, that's of course a very, very good question. And indeed, I would say the invasive species are the biggest challenge in restoration, at least in our region, because of course the invasive species are they may be drivers of degradation, but often they are the passengers, so they come into all degraded systems. And it will depend always on the species. Unfortunately, for very few species, we here really have working protocols on how to get rid of them, especially for the tropical grasses like Eragrostis plana and also the Ruacloa. It's very hard because they produce so many seeds, many of them very persistent in the seed bank. So we believe, and we very much and try to work on this on adaptive management. There's not a recipe, but we look at the site and then decide based on each situation what you have to do. Usually management, well, then it may be necessary to have initial treatments, like in central Brazil, people working in the Cerrado with Urucloa do some quite intensive treatments with herbicides and mechanical removal to get the systems out, the invasive species out, or at least reduce them to very low cover in the beginning. This, of course, has side effects. You may create soil disturbances that are not so beneficial as well, but it is a way to get them out from the early stages on. And then, of course, the idea is to create a native vegetation cover as quick as possible and to have species that could compete with the exotics. And that's the limitation we have. As I told you, we know very little about the native species, but this is where we're working at. So defining species that could compete more efficiently with invasives, and then adjust management. So for instance, Eragrostis plana is a grass, but cattle does not like it because it's very fibrous. It's just not good biomass to eat. So then, of course, if you have a grazed system, you have a negative feedback loop because cattle will always eat on the other species and the invasive species gets more dominant again. So then the option would be really to take cattle out for a longer period to have the other species develop and start competing with Eragrostis, and then maybe get into some mechanized control from time to time. So it's a huge challenge, and we all know as many species, it's grasses, it's shrubs, it's trees. Pine, even though it's one of the worst invaders, maybe the easiest one, I think, to control, unless you have, of course, propagal sources close to your restoration site. Then you will be pulling out pine saplings all the time. But then with fire, we can control that. So I think it's a big challenge all over the world. I have no recipe, I'm sorry. But we need to learn also from other countries. And I think for invasive species, it's important to look at the natural systems where the species come from to understand the biology of the species. I'm sometimes surprised to see how little we know about the biology of the invaders itself. But so I made a long comment, didn't really answer the question.
Great point. Fantastic. Okay, there's a couple questions about beyond understory vegetation or herbaceous vegetation. So one is about soils. Have you done any work with soils, or can you point participants to any work in soils, especially comparing scarification, amendments, shade cloths, other treatments between undisturbed and disturbed areas?
Yeah, that's a big question. Of course, I didn't have the time to show all experiments we did. We have some experience with some soil, not very much, I must say. And of course, there are some degradations that are more complicated in regarding soil features, like if you had use of a former grassland site for agriculture purposes, and you will have high nutrient loads, so high nitrogen, high phosphorus loads that are too high for the native species. That's a big problem, of course, because it's easier to fertilize than to take nutrients out. We know we should be working with that, like carbon addition, whatever. We haven't done that, but we have worked in some experiments with scarification to try to increase recruitment from the soil seed bank, where we thought we had a decent soil seed bank. It does work. Of course, you also stimulate the rural part of the soil seed bank community, and shade cloth is also working actually for some invasive species quite effectively. So we have one experiment underway now where we try to shade Urucloa decumbens, which is the invasive grass, by leaving a dark tarp, plastic tarp, for 30 days, and basically killing the invasive species. And this has been working, but then we still have the problem to bring the native species back in afterwards. So I think soil is key in many areas. It's not really my line of work, but I'm actually trying to build up more research with colleagues in this area. I think we all, many restoration ecologists come from vegetation science. We all need to learn about soil, definitely.
Yeah, great point. And, you know, restoration often has a vegetation or vegetation soils bias, and we've had a couple questions come in about wildlife. And so I wonder if you could point participants in the direction of anyone working on grassland restoration in Brazil that's explicitly looking at wildlife responses to restoration treatments. And then a second part to the question, also about how wildlife may affect implementation of the treatment. And I'll read you the actual question that came in from John David in the southwestern US. And John says, do you have a big problem with mice and other seed predators eating most of the seeds in your highly degraded ecosystems? We have that problem in some places in the southwest US.
Yeah, I will start with that last question. Yes, we do have that problem. We had this with hare in a recent experiment, an invasive species, and that really ate up all seedlings. So that's a big problem. So costs for experimentation even are very high because we have to fence everything. And regarding people working with fauna in restoration, there is some work going on with birds. So showing how grassland restoration benefits bird communities with interesting results. A part on restoration, other parts more on grassland management, showing the relevance of fire as a management tool, for instance, in changing structure of grasslands and thus increasing habitat heterogeneity for some groups of birds, which is very, very interesting. So there's relatively few studies on the response of the fauna on grassland restoration here, but we have some. We have some work, and whoever asked the question can send me an email and I can indicate you some work about fauna response, invertebrate response to grazing management, to fire management. So these communities of these species usually are quite resilient to disturbances, moderate disturbances. And a last point to this block of questions, we have a big problem with invasive boar here in the region, like in many regions of the world, and they really degrade grasslands on large scales. And this is a huge problem. Manu knows this because we had just been at a workshop in Lüneburg, and the colleague Michelle Deschum from Santa Catarina worked on that, and I just visited her sites. It's an immense problem. I was impressed. And so it's an invasive species. And of course, before you can start to restore, you should get rid of the invasive species. And that itself is an immense challenge. So yeah, both the native fauna is relevant as an indicator of restoration success, and the exotic fauna is a problem in restoration.
Great, thanks for that information. I think we have time for 2 more questions. One is about seed germination. Messeret is asking, there are some seeds that take a long time, up to a year, to germinate. Do you have any advice on ways to speed up the process?
Unfortunately, I'm not a specialist on seed physiology. We have colleagues in agronomy work on that. Of course, we have legumes that may require some kind of scarification or other procedures to break dormancy, or other species groups as well. We have done some experiments on the role of fire on germination. We wanted to find out if seeds here are stimulated to germinate by fire, by high temperatures, as we know from many fire-prone ecosystems. For our systems, we didn't find a stimulation by fire, by high temperatures, but it also didn't affect the seeds negatively. But we have many questions, so I'm sorry, it's not really my main field. People in agronomy who now are starting to work with native species for restoration are trying to find out more about seed ecology of the native grasses principally, because many of them have low germination rates, but we're really still in a very first phase of research here. I think it's a very important issue, and again, we should learn from other regions where we maybe have similar species and where more information is available.
Yeah, so much to learn about the seed part of restoration. Okay, I have one really big question for you. You have produced this amazing body of work along with your collaborators related to practical advice for restoration, best practice for grassland restoration, things to think about in implementation. And I'm wondering if you can share some advice on the best way to get this type of information innovated into practice in the hands of managers.
Yeah, well, from my perspective, it's important to try to integrate practitioners, be it managers in conservation units or farmers. So 95% of our areas, our grassland areas, are private property used for grazing. And it's really important to include these people in the research as soon as possible, to actually learn from them also what's important to do research about. I mean, I come from a university, I have my ideas and perspectives, but it's the manager who has to decide then on what he wants to restore and what he wants to conserve. So I think this very early dialogue is very important. This is, of course, a challenge, and everybody knows that we talk the same language, but we use very different terms sometimes. The objectives are different. It's a matter of time also, but it's an investment that's really worth it. And our best results actually come from projects that were designed in interaction with people working in practice. They may not be perfect restoration from an academic perspective, like we did reach total biodiversity we wanted to restore, but they are projects that work and that lead into the right direction. And I think that's more important. So I showed you that we have almost no seeds available. So we need to start restoring with with what we have, the techniques we have available. It's not perfect, but it's something the farmer or the manager can apply, and then we go step by step, and each year try to improve a little bit. So I think this permanent dialogue, and actually this is something that we still need to learn in academics also, to how to work with that. So we get out of the usual research project, which is just small plots, but transform this into a real farm setting, for instance. So I think that's the main point, but I also don't have a perfect answer.
And do you think that there have been changes in the practices being used for grassland restoration in Brazil as a result of the research that is being shared?
I think yes, not maybe on the very large scale, because of course what's actually really driving what's going on large scale in terms of land use are economics and overarching politics. And of course we don't have really large incentive still, despite the decade of ecosystem restoration and all these initiatives that are very important. The real support, like by payment for ecosystem services and restoration financing schemes, is still not yet there. So I think that's, of course, important also to get to the politics interface and really start raising awareness for these problems. I think we're making progress, though. So of course, we always complain there could be more that should be done. But I think the topic of grassland restoration in Brazil 5 years ago was not being discussed at all. And now we do have plans and goals for that. So, and we start working.
Yeah, really so important to bring the grasslands into it and make sure that we're restoring for climate, for biodiversity, for socio-cultural outcomes, all of that. Thank you so much